For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the face of late-night television. Every night, millions tuned in to The Tonight Show for his quick jokes, sharp timing, and easy laughter with Hollywood's biggest stars. To viewers, it felt like sitting with old friends at the end of the day. But behind the curtain, Carson saw things differently. He was more than a host. He was an observer. He paid attention to how people behaved when the cameras stopped rolling. He noticed who treated staff with kindness and who treated them with contempt. Every star who wanted to reach the American public had to pass through Johnny's stage. That gave him a unique vantage point. Over time, Johnny formed private judgments, and in his own quiet way, he kept a mental list, a blacklist of stars he considered not just difficult, but truly unpleasant. He rarely spoke of this list publicly, but those who worked with him, producers, writers, stagehands, remembered the whispers during commercial breaks and the sharp comments he shared afterward. 9 names stood out. They were actors, singers, and legends of Hollywood's so-called golden age. On stage, they charmed the world. But offstage, Johnny believed they revealed something darker.
I can answer that by telling you that in those lovely moments, I play Daphnis and Chloe.
Johnny Carson admired talent above all else, and Frank Sinatra had it in abundance. He was the voice of mid-century America, a movie star and a cultural icon. On the air, Carson treated him with respect, joking and smiling through their interviews. But off-camera, Johnny saw a side of Sinatra that disturbed him deeply. Sinatra never arrived alone. He came with an entourage, men who weren't entertainers but looked and acted like bodyguards. Crew members said it felt like being under watch. One cameraman later recalled, "It was like being stared at in an alley. They weren't here for TV. They were here to make sure nothing crossed Frank." The most infamous incident came in the early 1970s. A floor manager gave Sinatra the routine 3-minute warning before his segment. Every guest got the same cue. Sinatra responded by grabbing the man's tie, yanking him close, and snarling, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The manager, a Korean War veteran who had faced real combat, walked away shaken. Johnny, watching from his office monitor, nearly pulled the plug on Sinatra's appearance. Only his producer's reminder that Sinatra's presence guaranteed ratings convinced him to go forward. Sinatra also canceled appearances at the very last minute. More than once, he showed up at the studio, then simply decided he wasn't in the mood. The entire show would be thrown into chaos. For Carson, who valued timing and professionalism, this was unforgivable. But the final straw came during a commercial break. Sinatra made a cruel remark about a female staffer's appearance, loud enough for others to hear. Johnny, normally cautious about confrontation, didn't let it pass. He looked at Sinatra and said coldly, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The room went silent. Sinatra, unaccustomed to being challenged, looked surprised. When the cameras came back, both men smiled for the audience. But Carson's warmth was gone. His questions grew shorter, his tone sharper. Afterward, he told his producer, "Limit him to once a year." For a host who almost never interfered in booking decisions, that said everything. Sinatra may have been a legend, but Johnny believed talent was no excuse for bullying. And if Sinatra ruled with power, the next guest unsettled him with something colder, a smile that hid nothing but ice.
Well, first of all, I'm stage struck, and I think they all know that. Secondly, I try to get a film that has audience identification.
Joan Crawford was Hollywood royalty. With her posture, poise, and presence, she embodied the glamour of old Hollywood. When she appeared on The Tonight Show in 1970, viewers saw elegance and charm. But behind the scenes, Carson saw another side, one that left him chilled. The trouble began before she even arrived. Crawford sent a 4-page memo with precise instructions: lighting angles, desk height, chair placement, even the exact studio temperature, 67 degrees on the dot. She insisted on her own makeup team, dismissing the show's award-winning staff. But what truly revealed her character was how she treated people she considered unimportant. When a young assistant carried water into her dressing room, Crawford erupted. Witnesses remembered her calling the girl a brainless little fool and suggesting she look for work where incompetence might be useful. The assistant fled in tears. Crawford demanded she be fired. The producer refused, but the tension lingered throughout the evening. Once the cameras rolled, Crawford transformed. She smiled, laughed, and performed every answer as though rehearsed. The moment the red light went off, her face hardened. She sat in silence until the next cue. Carson, known for drawing warmth from even nervous guests, couldn't connect with her at all. Afterward, he told Ed McMahon, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, when Christina Crawford released Mommy Dearest, detailing abuse in her childhood, Johnny wasn't shocked. He quietly told friends, "I saw who she really was that day. I believe every word." Crawford's coldness was unsettling, but the next guest was sharp in a different way. using words like weapons and turning every conversation into combat.
Spelled out in light bulbs, I mean. Besides something called a temperament, which consists most...
Bette Davis was one of the greats. Her sharp voice, her commanding stare, and her quick wit made her unforgettable on screen. Audiences tuned in to see a Hollywood legend swap stories with Johnny. But to Carson, her appearances felt less like friendly interviews and more like courtroom battles. When Davis shared the couch with other guests, she made it clear who she thought deserved attention. If another actor or comedian began telling a story, Davis would physically turn her back, shutting them out. If the audience laughed at someone else, she bristled. Crew members swore they could see her waiting for the perfect moment to cut in and take the spotlight back. Alcohol often played a role. Davis asked for whiskey in her dressing room before every taping. That wasn't unusual for the era, but combined with her sharp tongue, it sometimes led to uncomfortable scenes. One night, she interrupted a younger actress mid-sentence with a sarcastic quip so biting that the woman stopped speaking altogether. The studio audience laughed, but backstage staff traded uneasy glances. According to some staff, Davis also used language that shocked even by the standards of the 1970s. Several women remembered her making sexual remarks about their looks, and a few recalled hearing racially charged barbs that left the room silent. Johnny, who avoided confrontation whenever possible, reportedly drew the line more than once, reminding her firmly, "Not here, not on my show." Staff later said it was the only time they ever saw Davis visibly stunned into silence. Carson respected her artistry. He knew she was a genuine legend, one of the most important actresses of the century, but he dreaded her presence. After her final appearance in the early 1980s, he turned to his producer and sighed, "That's the last time. Life's too short to be flogged by Bette Davis, no matter how many Oscars she has." Davis used words as weapons. The next guest used something else entirely. Ego so oversized it swallowed the show whole.
Now, the argument against what I'm saying is that the world is full. All the best young directors are soaked.
Orson Welles was brilliant. The man behind Citizen Kane carried with him an aura of greatness. His booming voice and larger-than-life stories were enough to fill an hour by themselves. But Carson didn't invite him to run the show. He invited him to be a guest. And that distinction was something Welles seemed unable or unwilling to recognize. The problems often started before the cameras rolled. Carson's writers would prepare a list of questions carefully balanced to guide the segment. Welles dismissed them as pedestrian. More than once, he crossed out every line, handed the page back blank, and announced he'd talk about what he wanted. On air, he launched into stories that stretched on and on. A 7-minute slot ballooned into 25. Johnny gave subtle signals. A tap of the pencil, a polite nod, even leaning forward in his chair, cues every other guest understood. Welles ignored them. Entire segments had to be cut, leaving other guests bumped. One producer said it was like he thought the show was a kingdom, and he was the king. Welles also treated The Tonight Show set like his own film set. He brought props without warning, changed topics mid-sentence, and even tried giving directions to the cameramen from his chair. "Pan left," he once barked, pointing toward himself as Johnny's eyes narrowed. Crew members could practically see the steam rising from Carson's ears. What irritated Johnny most wasn't just the wasted airtime, it was what Welles represented. Carson, who valued preparation and professionalism, saw in Welles a cautionary tale. Friends recalled him, saying that Welles's genius had been drowned out by his own self-importance. "Talent is a gift," Johnny said, "but ego can strangle it." In Welles, Carson saw exactly what he never wanted to become. Johnny admired Welles's genius, but he saw in him a warning. "Genius doesn't excuse everything," he told Ed McMahon afterward. To Johnny, Welles was proof that talent and ego, unchecked, could destroy professionalism. If Welles hijacked the show with his ego, the next guest humiliated it with behavior that crossed into something Johnny could neither excuse nor ignore.
Some too? Oh, sure. Makes you strong and tall.
Mickey Rooney had once been America's boy wonder. In the late 1930s, he was the #1 box office star. By the 1970s, he was a living connection to Hollywood's golden age. On paper, his Tonight Show appearances should have been warm trips down memory lane. Instead, they left Johnny embarrassed. Rooney arrived buzzing with restless energy. Sometimes he was sober, sometimes not. Either way, the result was chaos. He interrupted Johnny's questions, spoke over other guests, and careened through stories that didn't always make sense. In one infamous appearance, he began talking about Judy Garland, his longtime co-star, in a way that turned inappropriate and deeply uncomfortable. Johnny cut him off mid-sentence, pivoting desperately to another topic. During the break, he muttered to his producer, "Is he drunk or is this just who he is now?" For Johnny, Rooney's behavior was more than inconvenient. It was humiliating. Crew members remembered him telling his producer after one taping, I've never been so embarrassed by a guest. For a host who prided himself on control, Rooney's unpredictability was a source of personal shame. But what troubled Carson most wasn't Rooney's lack of focus. It was how he treated women on the set. Multiple production assistants reported the same pattern. Rooney would grab their hands, hold their wrists a beat too long, pull them closer while asking personal questions about their relationships. Some assistants begged to be reassigned when they learned Rooney was booked. Johnny hated it. After one appearance, he personally apologized to a young actress who had shared the couch with Rooney, telling her, "That's not how professionals act on my show, and it won't happen again." From then on, Rooney's spots were limited. If the show had to feature him, producers scheduled a daytime pre-taping, never a live evening broadcast. Carson had seen egos, and he had seen tantrums, but Rooney's behavior crossed into something darker, disrespect that left staff shaken. If Rooney unsettled the set with chaos, the next guest threw it into disarray with demands so absurd they bordered on parody.
I don't see, my last marriage was one day, and I didn't think it will last that.
Zaza Gabor was made for television. She sparkled, she flirted, she entertained. Audiences adored her exaggerated Hungarian accent and her endless stories about husbands in high society. But to the Tonight Show staff, she was exhausting. Her list of demands became infamous behind the scenes. She required orchids in her dressing room, never carnations. The room had to be set at exactly 74 degrees. A bottle of Perrier with 3 ice cubes, not 2, not 4. She insisted the show fly in her personal lighting technician at its own expense, and she demanded no female guest under 40 appear on the same program. If those demands weren't met precisely, Gabor sometimes refused to leave her dressing room. On one occasion, she discovered the makeup department didn't have her preferred brand of foundation. She erupted, shouting until Johnny himself phoned her. "Za, darling, you look beautiful already," he told her, coaxing her onto the stage with charm. But Carson's patience wore thin. "I'd rather interview a cat," he joked afterward. At least the cat wouldn't need 3 assistants and special lighting. After one particularly frustrating night, he added, "Next time she wants to come on, tell her we've renamed it The Tonight Show, starring Zaza Gabor, and I'll be happy to play her sidekick." Despite everything, Gabor continued to appear because she delivered ratings. But for Johnny, her antics were another reminder that glamour often came at the expense of everyone else's time. If Gabor's vanity caused delays, the next guest brought something far more volatile. Passion so raw, it sometimes felt like a storm tearing through the set.
Ow. The obnoxious mama.
Shelley Winters had 2 Oscars and a career spanning decades. She was outspoken, fiercely intelligent, and impossible to control. On screen, that made her riveting. On The Tonight Show, it made her a storm. Johnny might start with a simple question about her latest role. Within seconds, Winters was off on a tangent about politics, corruption, or social issues. What was meant to be a light chat turned into a fiery 5-minute monologue. Carson, normally the master of steering conversations, often had no choice but to sit back and wait. It was like trying to steer a tornado, a producer remembered. The crew prepared accordingly. Before her appearances, stagehands removed glasses, ashtrays, and small props from the set just in case. Winters had a reputation for physical outbursts, including the time she famously threw a drink in Oliver Reed's face during a British talk show. No one knew when her temper might flare. One stagehand admitted, "We loved her, but we were nervous." Anything throwable disappeared before she arrived. And yet, Winters was different from others on Johnny's mental blacklist. Her volatility came not from cruelty, but conviction. She believed in her causes, and she used every stage to push them. Carson respected her honesty, even if it left him drained. After one fiery segment, he sighed to his producer. "I may not want to vacation with her, but at least she means every word she says." Still, Winters left the set in chaos more than once. But Johnny could forgive passion. What he couldn't forgive was prejudice. And that's what he saw in his next guest.
I like big muscles and red corpuscles. I like a beautiful.
Jane Russell was a Hollywood icon, remembered for The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. She brought glamour and history to The Tonight Show. But by the 1970s, her private views clashed with Johnny's values. According to staff, Russell refused to let a gay makeup artist work on her, demanding a replacement. She allegedly told producers she wouldn't appear on the same episode as Rock Hudson, whose sexuality, though not public at the time, was an open secret in Hollywood. What made this particularly offensive to Carson was that he counted many gay writers and staff among his closest allies. Johnny was ahead of his time, one producer remembered. He didn't care who you loved. He cared how you treated people. Crew members also recalled her making dismissive comments about civil rights legislation during a commercial break in 1973. Several people overheard, and the remarks quickly reached Johnny. Carson didn't mind differences of opinion, but he refused to allow discrimination against his staff or his guests. After that night, Russell disappeared from the guest list. For Carson to personally veto a star of her stature was rare, but in his mind, necessary. If Russell represented prejudice, the final name on Johnny's blacklist embodied something worse: hypocrisy. A comedian who played the saint on television, but backstage was described as one of the cruelest guests Johnny ever faced.
I've never asked you this, but I'm asking you now simply, purely, hold it!
Jerry Lewis was one of the most famous comedians in the world. His slapstick routines had made him a global star. His telethons for muscular dystrophy raised millions. To the public, he was a symbol of generosity and childlike energy. To Johnny Carson, he was the most hateful guest he ever hosted. On air, Lewis dominated. He talked over Johnny, hijacked questions meant for others, and turned every segment into his own performance. In one appearance, he reached across and adjusted Johnny's tie. It looked playful to the audience, but staff knew Johnny hated being touched. Some whispered that Lewis did it deliberately, as a power move. "He's what happens when ego outruns talent," Johnny later muttered. Backstage, Lewis was far worse. He refused to learn staffers' names, calling them camera guy or makeup girl, no matter their experience. One afternoon during rehearsal, a cameraman coughed softly. Lewis stopped everything and launched into a tirade, shouting that the man breathed like an amateur and demanding he be removed. The cameraman had allergies. The staff was horrified. Carson could forgive ego. He could even forgive chaos. What he could not forgive was cruelty, especially toward those with no power to fight back. After Lewis's final appearance, Johnny turned to his producer and said flatly, "Never again." Years later, he reportedly told friends, "In a town full of phonies, he stands out as truly hateful." And that takes some doing. Carson's blacklist was short, but it wasn't the whole story. There were other celebrities who didn't quite earn a permanent ban, but who left Johnny shaking his head more than once. They weren't monsters, but they made life on The Tonight Show more difficult than it had to be. Take Marlon Brando, for example. Brando rarely agreed to late-night interviews. When he did, it was usually a spectacle. On stage, he could be brilliant, but offstage, he made little effort to hide his disdain for the format. Producers recalled him, demanding changes to the running order and brushing off pre-interview questions as beneath him. Carson admired Brando's acting, but he often joked privately that the man seemed determined to prove he was too big for the couch. When Brando finally did appear, his aloofness left Johnny frustrated, convinced that Brando viewed the entire evening as a chore. Then there was Lucille Ball. America's favorite redhead, beloved by audiences for her warmth and comedy, could be surprisingly difficult behind the scenes. She was fiercely professional, but that professionalism sometimes came out as temper. Crew members recalled her snapping at assistants if makeup or lighting wasn't just right. Johnny respected Lucy. He knew her pioneering work in television had paved the way for hosts like him, but he also recognized that her perfectionism could sour the mood backstage in an instant. Carson also had mixed feelings about Dean Martin. Dean's charm was undeniable, but his casual approach to television sometimes tested Johnny's patience. He would show up late, occasionally still recovering from a night of partying, and stroll onto the set as if time didn't matter. The audience loved the image of Dean as the carefree crooner. But to Carson, it was another example of how some stars believed the rules didn't apply to them. And yet, none of these names carried the weight of his blacklist. They were frustrating, yes. They reminded him that even the brightest stars could have shadows. But Johnny didn't consider them truly dangerous or hateful. They were simply difficult, the kind of challenges any talk show host learns to navigate. For Carson, the real measure of character wasn't talent or fame. It was how people behaved when no one was watching. And while Brando, Ball, and Martin had their moments, they never crossed the lines that turned irritation into contempt. Those lines were reserved for the 9 names Johnny never forgot. And in those 9 names, Johnny's private judgments revealed more than gossip. They revealed his entire code. For every star who landed on Carson's quiet blacklist, there were others who reminded him why he loved the job in the first place. Johnny wasn't cynical about all of Hollywood. In fact, some of his fondest memories came from guests who treated The Tonight Show as a privilege, not a platform. At the top of that list was Jimmy Stewart. The beloved actor of It's a Wonderful Life and countless classics was one of Johnny's favorites. Stewart was soft-spoken, humble, and endlessly polite. Crew members remembered that he always arrived early, greeted everyone by name, and never asked for special treatment. When Stewart read one of his poems on the show, even Carson was moved to tears. Afterward, Johnny told Ed McMahon, "That's how a star should carry himself." Bob Hope was another guest who stood out. Hope had been a giant in radio, movies, and television long before Johnny took over The Tonight Show. Yet despite his fame, he never acted like the room belonged to him. Hope worked with the crew, hit his marks perfectly, and always had a kind word for assistants bustling in and out of the studio. Johnny admired his professionalism. More than once he said, "With Hope, you never had to worry." He gave the audience what they came for every time. And then there was Jack Benny, Carson's personal idol. Benny's dry wit and impeccable timing had shaped Johnny's own sense of comedy. But what Johnny cherished most was that Benny's humor didn't stop when the cameras cut. He cracked jokes with the stagehands, teased the producers gently, and never raised his voice in anger. To Carson, Benny was living proof that greatness and kindness could exist in the same person. These guests weren't just good television. They were reminders of the standard Johnny hoped Hollywood would live up to. They showed that fame didn't have to make people cruel, that success didn't require arrogance, and that talent could coexist with humility. When Johnny compared them to the names on his blacklist, the difference was striking. One group left him drained and disappointed. The other left him grateful, reminded that behind all the masks of show business, true character could still shine through. To Johnny, the true measure of a star wasn't fame or applause. It was kindness when no one was watching. And in that way, his private judgments revealed more about Hollywood than any interview ever could.